In times of trauma and adversity, we must create space for connection by sharing a story of hope. Welcome to Stories of Hope Worldwide, hosted by Kerry Atherton. This podcast shares inspiring stories of individuals who have faced significant challenges and emerged stronger, offering hope and resilience to listeners all over the world. Join Kerry, the founder of Stories of Hope, every week to hear these remarkable journeys and find strength to overcome your adversity. Now, let's listen in to this week's conversation.
Welcome to another episode of Stories of Hope Worldwide. I'm Kerry Atherton and I'm your host. And today's guest is Jackie Schatz. Jackie went from an idyllic lifestyle, growing up in a privileged home in Singapore, to ending up as a meth addict and doing time in prison. But there's a lot to this story in between, including the heartbreak of being forced to leave her son behind in Papua New Guinea. So welcome, Jackie.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Great to finally have you on the show. And you've been one of our Stories of Hope live guests before. And your story, gosh, they could write a movie about you. And there's so much to it. You've been through like to hell and back.
Yeah.
But your story is really a great story of hope. And so we're looking forward to hearing all about it today. So can you take us back to the idyllic lifestyle that you grew up in and then lead us into where everything went wrong?
Oh, absolutely. So I was born in Singapore to what one would call a very privileged existence. I had two incredible parents. My mum was Singaporean Chinese and she had married my dad, who was actually Australian. And my father was a fair bit older than my mother. They both were incredible parents, but rather strict. At the same time, I was an only child. So I was kind of they expected a lot out of me, but it was out of love. There was a real spirit of excellence that I felt myself striving for. So from a very young age, I was thrown into piano and ballet and ice skating. I sort of had my finger in every pie. And being in Singapore, they put me in local school. So I was forced to learn Chinese, like as a Mandarin and English, both at a first language level. So that was a lot of pressure because we didn't speak Mandarin at home. And I had an amazing childhood. Like a lot of people talk about brokenness. I can't really relate to that, except that at one point I remember just feeling a little bit overwhelmed. And the time came when they nominated me as a prefect. So they had put my picture up on a board at school. And these talent scouts that wanted to essentially find some people to host television shows saw my picture. And so from 13 years of age, I started hosting television shows in Singapore. And at the time, Singapore was a fairly small country. I think it was about 2 million or 2.5 million. So it got to the point where over the course of several years, I would actually go out and be recognized and people would come up to me. And, it was somewhat of a celebrity status, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
I got to interview people like Tiffany, Debbie Gibson. I'm really showing my age now. They were pop stars, I think, in the 90s. 80s and 90s, actually, they were. And all was well. And then I started modeling. With that pressure, I think, came, I think the start of mental illness, for lack of a better word, because I started to be anorexic and that became bulimic. So I was quite badly bulimic all through my teenage years. When I turned 16, my parents decided to move back to Australia. And I think that was probably the first real big change in my life that caused a lot of upheaval. I lost my sense of identity, for lack of a better word, because when I was in Singapore, my identity was that, I guess, of a celebrity for quite a long time. And when you're grappling with that and also, your hormones and a teenager and all of that, and then being thrust into a country that I really hadn't grown up in, I struggled to make friends. I struggled to fit in. So the bulimia became a lot worse. But because I did so well at school, I ended up going to university. And I did a degree in arts and law. And I think that's sort of when I started to go a little bit off the rails. In Singapore, I was in an all-girls Catholic school from the age of
Oh, yes, I've been in one of them.
16. Yep. So I think that after grade 11 and 12, and once I got into university, that is sort of when I got into that, bit boy crazy and started experimenting with drinking, which I think is pretty normal at that age. I would be what others classify as a late bloomer. And all was sort of well, but the very, very first, I think, breaking point in my life came when I was sexually assaulted at 23 years of age.
Oh,
Yeah. So, as you can imagine, that was incredibly difficult. And so that night coincided with the very first time that I was actually offered recreational drugs. So, I think I carried a lot of shame, I think, in the belief that, the recreational drugs probably led me to sort of being in a position where I was probably a bit more vulnerable. And then after that, one would say I developed the pattern of numbing my pain through drugs.
yeah.
So at that point in time, it was probably me dabbling in a lot of cocaine. That was pretty much the first thing I sort of became, one would say, addicted to. And when I say addicted, it always that's always what it starts off as. It starts off as a recreational thing, and then I find it lifts my spirits because I was pretty down as a result of the assault. I refused to let it claim my life. My father unfortunately passed away probably 2 years after the assault.
Oh, Jack.
Yeah, so it culminated in me really starting to struggle with, depression and drug taking. But I also decided that, I was going to do my best to try because I was fairly deep into my university degree. By that stage, I had completed the arts component, majoring in psychology, which is quite ironic because I probably was going through a whole gamut of, what were psychological disorders at the time as a result.
I just ask you, did you tell anyone? Because
Yes.
there's a lot of people listening to this today that
Yep.
might have been through sexual assault, and I for one am one of those people.
Yep.
I didn't tell anyone,
Yep.
when I was 17, but yeah, so who did you tell at the time?
Believe it or not, I went to the police. And
Ri
so I had started seeing a lovely guy at the time. I met him for dinner and then I went out with my friends after meeting him with dinner, but not with him. So he was he was ringing me the next day asking me, how was your night out? So essentially it happened in the toilet of a nightclub.
Oh god.
And at that time I considered it rape as such, and I know that's a very controversial word, trigger warning, but it was sexual assault almost to that degree. I told the guy, and he said, You've got to go to the police."
Yeah.
So the perpetrator was actually arrested within 24 hours. The
Wow.
police were incredible,
Yeah.
and it was at that point where, and I can't speak highly enough of the police officers at the time. So he was actually faced with a Supreme Court trial. And unfortunately, over the course of 2 years, my father passed away. And it really affected my ability to study. And unfortunately, he was found not guilty. However, in the course, and I mean, that sounds like, a horrific outcome. I guess that's why a lot of people don't go to report it because, they may not get the outcome they want. However, what I do need to say is in the course of leading up to a trial, I had two other females approach me telling me that the same individual had done exactly the same thing to them in exactly the same manner that he had done it to me,
Right.
and they hadn't reported it. And so one of them was saying, "I'm right behind you." And I was begging them, please, if you go to the police, he will go to jail. Like there is, and as it turned out, the courts basically deemed that they had no doubt that something had happened, but they couldn't satisfy it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is what that legal point is. And so you can imagine I was incredibly disillusioned because I was actually doing law at the time. And to be honest, I think I'm not trying to blame that point in my life, but that was sort of when I really lost faith in the judicial system.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad I went ahead and reported him, because I would be very, very surprised if after him going to trial, he would have done it again. I haven't, heard of him committing offences against women ever since. So if one thing I think I managed to do was probably stop him, at the end of the day, that was all I was trying to achieve. I just did not want what I went through to happen to another female. And it did. It really sort of changed the trajectory, I think, of my university studies and everything like that. And my father passed away. He was quite ill at that time, I think, with that grief of what had happened to, his daughter. And that was at that point also that I met my now ex-husband, and I went on to have my son with him. So that, I guess in every heartbreak, in every brokenness, there always comes, I think, good that comes out of a bad situation. That's how I'd like to see
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
And his son is adorable. I've seen photos.
He's a big boy now.
I know.
Yeah. So, and I guess that's sort of where the next part of my story goes. So I managed to sort of get back to some normality of life. I ended up working for law firms as a paralegal at one stage, and then, as a legal secretary, because I never finished my studies. And at that time, my ex-husband got offered a great job in Papua New Guinea, and that is where we decided to move. So my son wasn't quite 3 years of age. And I sort of need to say that whilst I was quite heavily addicted to cocaine leading up to having my son really threw me back on the path of being good again. I was really, all throughout pregnancy, I was totally clean. I was breastfeeding for a good part of the first year, so I was clean through all of that. So having my son was great to sort of normalize my life again and get me back on track, which was amazing, And when we moved to Papua New Guinea, unfortunately, after 3 years, the marriage broke down. My son was not quite 6 at the time, and,
What was the cause of that, do you think, Jackie?
it was a bit of both. I don't believe, whilst my ex-husband, with all respect to him and what he's doing now and what he's achieved in his life, and this is and I've got to quantify, all respect to him, we probably were never a good match to begin with.
Okay.
And I think I was young, and I was pretty. This is a terrible term to use, but I was pretty messed up. I was still carrying my wounds, and I think that as a female, it's so important to heal before you go on to establish that next stage of your life. And I didn't. I sort of used my ex-husband to escape from, I think, the pain and what had happened and what was going on. So I don't believe we were compatible to begin with.
Yeah.
My, ex-husband, I think, is can be quite a quiet individual. And I guess I, at that time, was seeking validation and constant love and reassurance instead of building it within myself. I was trying to get it from someone else. And he focused on his work, and, the marriage pretty much broke up. There was infidelity on my part, and I dare say probably subsequently his. So I take full responsibility. It just was a whole disaster, I think, from the start. So unfortunately, I can look back now and pin fingers, but and the reason why I'm quite hesitant to speak ill of him now is, even in the last 3 years, he's quite substantially changed his life. And it's sort of been like what one would call a roller coaster of emotions from back then to now. And so I'm quite reserved of how I speak of him now, just because I've seen him actually do his best to turn his life around. So out of respect, I probably won't, However, unfortunately, at that time, he got my spousal visa cancelled. And so I was forced to return back to Australia without my son. And at that time, I felt that probably a boy was better off with his dad, not realizing how much boys need their mums.
And how old was your son then?
My son wasn't even 6. He was just shy of 6. That was, I think, if I look at a point in my life where I was broken beyond belief, that was that point. So when I came back to Australia, you know, I didn't even have a chance to properly say goodbye to him. I was marched out of the house in a very unceremonious fashion and forced to come back. So, I had nothing. I had nobody. I mean, I had my mum and my family as such, but at that point in time, I tried to rebuild my life here, and I was struck with horrific depression, horrific loneliness. I felt like my entire purpose to my existence had been stripped because being a mother meant absolutely everything to me.
Yeah.
So, it to me at that point, that was what defined me.
Was your reason really, wasn't it, for turning your life around?
Yeah, absolutely. At that point in time, it was. So then came the time where out of complete loneliness, I did the only thing I knew how. I basically sought to turn to drugs again. Because prior to that, when I was 23, that was what I used and that was what I knew would numb the pain. So I reached out and managed to track down, because I guess it's never hard, when you're looking for unsavory. And back when I was using cocaine, it was sort of called rock. And so now I went looking for rock. And rock in the 10 years, the slang for rock actually was now methamphetamine.
Oh,
So I was introduced to the very insidious methamphetamine that I now call the devil's drug.
and
It
so
was
also known as ice.
known as ice, yes. And ice was the worst possible thing that I could ever been introduced to, because it took me from a state of utter depression and not being able to function to giving me energy. And obviously, with ice, what it does to your chemicals in your brain, it dumps a huge amount of serotonin and a huge amount of dopamine into your brain. It gives you a sense of euphoria when you first take it. So, for someone who was utterly broken, in the pits of complete depression, it helped me to function. And very gradually, it became a little bit a day to a full-blown habit. So I began to use what I would call small amounts, but it became every day. And at that time, I was going through a custody battle with my ex-husband. So, I was trying to get my son back, and he would then accuse me of being an unfit mother, which I guess at that time I probably was, because I was on drugs. And I would try and pull myself together whenever my son would visit. And I think in that period of 2 years, perhaps, he came in and visited every school holidays, and I'd try and pull myself together every time he came. And then when he went back to his dad, I was back in the pits of depression again, and my drug addiction would spiral and spiral and spiral. So it came to the point, I guess, when as a female, you have a couple of choices. And this is the very horrific world of drug addiction and being a female, because affording drugs is almost impossible. So I guess you can go down the route of selling your body. And, I'm not mincing words here. Or you can start to deal drugs. I couldn't bring myself to do the former. And so I ended up peddling in a little bit of drug dealing, being a terrible drug dealer, because I would end up using all the drugs and end up in financial strife.
Could we just go back a bit? How much was your habit a week at this stage?
At that point in time, before I started sort of dealing drugs, I would probably be using only about a point a day. So that would probably be a little bit less than a gram. So a gram, from what I remember, I think it's 10 points. At that time, though, I think I was paying maybe $100 a day. It's
Yeah.
a lot of money, especially a lot of money. And at my very worst, so this is like fast forwarding maybe, 8 years into my addiction, I was easily using 17.5 points a day, right? So I went from 1 point a day to
Wow.
17.5 points a day. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was 8 years on.
That was, yes, because
Long addiction to us, isn't it?
yes, that is how rapidly one can spiral downhill, because what started off as smoke, so I used to put it in what would be like a glass pipe. That's a device people use to smoke it in. Unfortunately, I ended up becoming an intravenous user.
Right.
And, if I think back to my childhood, I mean, Singapore is a country that used to exercise capital punishment for drugs. They have a very, very tough stance on drug addiction. So you can imagine what a horrific fall from grace that would have been for me. Someone who, I guess teenagers used to look up to. I mean, people, look upon celebrities one way, but one thing I always like to think was I'd like to, back when I was in my teens and early 20s, like to consider myself, I guess, a role model for others. And yeah, that was a huge fall from grace for me. And my habit became so bad in the end that I was intravenously using. And because that high would maybe last for an hour, I was smoking the pipe in between having 3 shots a day.
Wow. What a
So,
yeah.
and I don't mean to laugh, because it really is no laughing matter, but that is just what that drug does to you.
Yeah.
And so essentially what I found I ended up having to do was I ended up dating drug dealers and forming relationships with drug dealers. And I went from one to the other, to the other, to the other, all escaping. And I think domestic violence goes with hand in hand with that whole scene of drug addiction, because the relationships you form are based on drugs. They're transactional. I would bring the person that I was dating at the time, and dating is such a stupid word, because you never ever went on dates. It was really this really toxic thing where you would literally sit in some crack den and just basically do drugs together. And then in between, I was bringing them customers so that I would then get my share of the drugs. And it was just probably the most horrific time. And this period where I guess, things were at rock bottom went on for at least 3 years, where I was completely homeless.
Wow.
I did not have a home to call my own. So I either went from someone's couch to another person's couch, or, a room, or even garages at that stage. Or I would latch on to whoever I was with at the time, and we would go from motel room to motel room. It was just, there was nothing else but ice at the time. That was all my life was.
And for anyone out there that's got a habit or is dabbling, don't be under any illusion that that's not going to happen to you, what happened to Jack, because I counsel addicts and I hear this same story, but in different variants of how severe, the outside world got. But it's just the path, isn't it? It's just
It is.
what ends up happening.
There's 3 paths, 2 of which are the most prevalent. So the 2 paths that are not a matter of if, but I think a matter of when,
Yeah.
are either jail or death. I have known, I can't count on my hands, 2 hands, how many people that I've known that have passed away.
No.
Because when you're doing ice, a lot of people also, if you've been up, you need something to take you down.
Yeah.
And so what I think goes hand in hand now, which absolutely breaks my heart, and I've seen it over the course of my addiction, and thank goodness it was not something that I really couldn't get too heavily. My body just could not cope with it. But there's something called liquid fantasy, or GBH,
Yeah.
which is another horrific drug. And I knew so many people that were on that cocktail of up, down, up, down, up, down. With that, there's so many lives that have been lost. I mean, the third path, of course, is the path of recovery.
Yes. Our favourite.
Our favorite.
Yeah.
And
Anyone's favourite, really.
and that is the ultimate hope and blessing you could hope for. And it is a path that, let me say, is available to everybody. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, it's not a path that everyone gets the blessing to be on.
As you hear this story, what Kerry's discussing might be resonating strongly with you. Perhaps you've experienced something similar yourself and are looking for support. Kerry Atherton is an experienced counsellor and wellbeing coach and has private sessions available if you or someone you know needs some help. You don't have to deal with trauma, addiction, PTSD, and abuse alone. If you'd like to talk about today's episode or your own experiences, book a session with Kerry at empowerlifesolutions.com.au or check the link in the show notes and embrace a future filled with hope. Now back to the episode.
So, are you able to tell us about the part of your journey where you were kidnapped? Do you feel comfortable about to?
Oh, absolutely, because
That's
it's
crazy story.
it's
Like that's a
wild.
movie.
It is absolutely wild,
Yeah.
and to be honest, that actually happened quite early on. So I went from living in Brisbane to ending up on the Gold Coast for a period of probably about 3, 4 years, and that was the time where my addiction was at its worst. When I went to the Gold Coast, I ended up finding a room that I was able to stay at with someone who was very kind enough to let me stay in that room in exchange for providing drugs to that individual. And it was probably about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was pulled out of my sleep on my bedroom by someone with a machete. And it was like something out of a movie. It was, from what I remember, Sunday night, and we're in the middle of Paradise Point, which is quite a posh suburb.
Mm.
And I remember that individual saying to me, "Do you want long arm or short arm?" Which is a phrase that comes out of a movie called Blood Diamond in Africa, where literally when they chop the person's arm off and they give them an option, "No, we're just going to chop your hand off or your whole arm off." And I remember thinking to myself, what are the chances of this actually happening? And I going on a Sunday night in the middle of Paradise Point to me. And I think to myself, you know what? Probably quite high considering the craziness that my life had become.
Yeah.
As it turned out, they had a gripe with the person that I was seeing at the time, who was quite a high up dealer. They were hoping to extort a sum of money. So terrified, they put me in a truck and I traveled and in the truck, he had a shotgun. And he said, "If you run, I'm going to shoot you." And that was the point where I was just in a state of beyond disbelief. Now, if this could not get any worse, they literally took me about, I'd say, 5 minutes down the road to a car park. And mind you, it was still like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. So it was dark, but it was at that point when just that tiny bit of daylight starts to hit. So it's not pitch black. And then I was put in the boot of a car.
No.
And I just remember the part that had me absolutely fear stricken was that house that I stayed in. That guy used to get working girls come through, and he would sort of have some rooms where it was just not a good place, but I was so desperate for accommodation. So, working girls are girls that provide obviously, services. And so there was like bits of that, some of them had wigs lying around, and there was like, costumes and this and that. So I remember the guy pulling a wig with one hand as he's dragging me out of the house with the other and said, "Oh, well, one way or another, you're going to work this off." So that was in the back of my head. And when I was thrown into that boot, I can't even, till this day, there are a few things in your life that you'll like that are etched in your memory so deep. For me, there's certain points in my life, one of which I guess would be the birth of my son. So it's one of those points in your life that, till the day you die, I think you won't forget. This was one of them for me. I can still, till this day, just very clearly, and I can talk about this without trauma now, but the boot was closed. And the first thing I did, and this is crazy, I actually started ripping my fingernails, like biting my fingernails to leave in the boot, because being me and being into crime and watching crime documentaries, all I could think about was, I'm going to get dumped in the bush somewhere, and if they ever recover this car, I want my DNA to be on there. And I couldn't believe that was the first thing I thought about. And all I could think about was my son, praying and praying and praying. And I just thought, these guys are going to end up in a high speed chase somewhere. I'm going to they're going to crash somewhere, dump this vehicle. I'm going to be in the hot sun in this brute, suffocating to death for about 5 hours till I die. All these things were going through my head. And the journey probably lasted about 35, 40 minutes. And essentially, they just took me to someone else's house.
My goodness.
I had been to that house before, and then another guy popped out and he goes, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And then it was at that point where the guy with the shotguns and everything said to me, "Okay, well, you need to call someone now. We just won $1,000." And I'm thinking, are you serious? You have put me through this for $1,000. And at that time, they could not get hold of the guy that I was seeing because he was off in New South Wales doing a drug cook and uncontactable. And I thought to myself, he would easily probably have and I said, "Well, I've got no one. I can't call my mum. I literally have no one." And in the end, it just all petered out, and they were like, "Oh, well, I guess we'll take you back."
And
But
doesn't it go to just show the absolute desperation of the world?
but
Like, you see what people are doing for small amounts of money, like breaking into houses and cars. To do that for $1,000
But,
is
the absolute trauma that subjected me to,
oh,
and I thought to myself, I could have back in the day, $1,000 would have been nothing, but, that was for me with a machete and, they had another dagger in the car and a shotgun, and I literally at that point thought I was going to lose my life because traditionally, when you go for a boot ride, and I've learnt this now from, other criminals, you don't come back from that. So traditionally, a boot ride is where they take you and they dispose of you, and you don't come back. And normally, you really have to have done something quite horrific to warrant a boot ride. I know that at that time and point, a lot of people were quite suspicious of the fact that I might have been an undercover police officer or even working with the police because I spoke well, I was literate.
yeah.
They hadn't known of me before. So, I grew up in Singapore, and then I've landed in Brisbane, and then all of a sudden I've shown up on the Gold Coast. And it got a lot of people quite suspicious because I did not fit that traditional mold of a drug user or a drug addict. And this is when I guess, Carrie, I need to say that drugs are completely indiscriminate.
And that was what I was gonna call this, the title of this, that there is no
Yep.
discrimination.
There is absolutely no, you can come from a absolutely broken upbringing where your parents are addicts and you have been raised in the system, abused and all of that. And, not that that's an excuse, but one could understand quite easily why an individual who's had to go through so much in their life ends up succumbing to addiction. However, when you think about it, I've been from a very privileged upbringing, and I guess chasing maybe a little bit of excitement in my life because I had a very sterile upbringing in Singapore.
Yeah.
And then you fall into a pattern, I guess, where you end up experiencing your trauma in your life, and that is becomes, your crutch, and then that can rapidly take hold. So I guess it's so important I think education is key, and it's key to every individual realizing that unfortunately, due to any series of events in your life, anyone can be subjected and succumb to drug addiction if they're not
Yeah.
careful.
Yeah, true, true. So you went through the kidnap and your drug addiction, as you said before,
Yep.
continued on for a long time.
Yep.
I know you ended up in jail. So
Yes.
how did that happen? And then how did you come out the other side?
So to get to the point of jail, in that next 3 years, what I ended up doing was I went from one drug addict to the next to the next. And I guess I developed a bit of a reputation, as it were, for loyalty
Okay.
to the person I was seeing at the time, because obviously I was desperate to prove that I wasn't a police officer, I wasn't working with the police. So I ended up developing quite a reputation as being someone who would take charges, or if I was with the person at the male drug dealer at the time, I would hold their drugs for them. or take responsibility should anything happen. So I went from one to another until I ended up with someone who was probably one would consider at the quite high level of dealing. And when I talk about that, this individual was dealing in kilos. And so you're talking about trafficking levels at the time. He had a history for armed bank robbery, had done over 20 years jail.
Right.
He was a very hardened criminal. And at the time, I actually fell in love with this individual.
What was it that you fell in love with?
I fell in love with the point where I guess this individual was the most, like the greatest narcissist I could, and I use that term with great, venom, because that was exactly what he is. So he had basically convinced me almost to the point that he wanted to have children with me. And I guess he used to say, in this drug world, you can count on me to always keep my word. I'm a person of good moral standing. I will, if I say I'm going to do something, I'm doing something. If I say I'm going to protect you, I'm protecting you. And when I think I was so used to being betrayed and, robbed and beaten and everything by all these other lower individuals, when I came to someone like that, I was like, oh my goodness. And he's like, he would praise me and I would always seek his validation. And I became untouchable because I was his girl.
So he offered you security.
Oh, he did, because he basically, firearms were his game, and I felt safe. No one would touch me. Everyone who would used to bully me or rob me, or and I was continually robbed over and over and over again, or anyone would plot this or that, wouldn't even consider it because they knew that he would come for them.
Yeah.
So I fell in love with that notion of being this huge hardened criminal's girl. And at that time, that was what my life had become. That was my identity. My identity was, I'm a gangster's girl. And that is, I guess, just how sad and deluded the state of affairs had become. So with that territory as well, come police involvement. And with police involvement, they're no longer small charges.
Yeah.
And this individual was on parole at the time, and I had always said to him, out of love, if anything happened, I would take the charges for you, because I had always gotten into trouble, and there were just small charges. So at that time, I just had small possession charges. My charges were mostly for failures to appear, so nothing big at all. Then came the day where his stepmom's home was raided. I put my hand up for the charges. Now, at that time, I didn't realize, but there were actually 3 firearms in that home.
Oh, gosh.
One was loaded, and they weren't. I think the biggest charge I had was possession of a loaded firearm endangering life in a non-public place. That was a very serious charge. And also a large quantity of methamphetamine. So he had probably a kilo put away, but there was 2.5 ounces out there. So it was a substantial amount. I had no idea what I was putting my hand up to. I literally just put my hand up and said, everything here is mine and mine alone. And he had said to me, whispered in my ear, you'll be out by tonight. Well, he left me high and dry. So we
Oh, wow.
we were over at Benora Point when I got arrested. Then began the 5-day stay at the Tweed Heads Watch House, where I was eventually, and I was insistent. I was like, no, it's all mine. It's all mine. It's all mine. And eventually I ended up in maximum security jail in Sydney. It was a newish facility called Mary Wade Correctional Centre. Yeah, that was because of the charges being firearms and, what they would call, I can't remember, I think it was commercial possession at that time. I was in maximum security. I was one of the highest classified prisoners there.
Wow. Were you in that much denial that you thought, "No, he is gonna get me out of here. This
Yep.
is gonna work out," or I wasn't doing
Yeah.
it?
I was in that much
I was
denial.
gonna say, did you have a sinking feeling that, "Nah, no one's coming to get me," or did you keep
That very sickening feeling of I'm in big trouble.
Yeah, but you
Sort of
thought the rescuer would come and get you out eventually.
I pretty much expected what would be a private lawyer at least. I was
Yeah.
legal aid funded right to the bitter end. And thank God for my legal aid lawyer because she was amazing. She was probably, just as good as a private, but I was expecting private representation, which never came.
Oh,
I was expecting to be bailed out of the Tweed Heads courthouse. That never happened. And I think it was at a point of probably about 3 months into that I thought to myself, "Oh, no, I'm in some big trouble here."
yeah.
Because he stayed in touch with me.
Nice guy, hey?
Yeah, I got arrested on the, 28th of November, 2018. So, he came and visited me, in January, I think it was, and just before Valentine's Day, I remember that, he turned all his phones off. So at that time, he still said to me, "Oh, I'm working on getting you out. I'm getting the money together to get you a lawyer. I'm getting you bail. I'm getting you out," and all of that. And he even sent me a Christmas card proposing to me in the card, romantic guy. And I realize now, he pretty much had procured another fall girl 2 weeks into me being in jail. So I maintained an extremely good relationship with his stepmom at the time that's I still call mum now and still see.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, she has nothing to do with him anymore at all, as a result of what happened, because not only did he leave me high and dry, he left her home and it had been completely ransacked by the police. And, when I talk about at that level, when you play with the big boys, they literally turned her house upside down, full tactical squad, police dogs, everything. Her house was just not, and he just left her high and dry. And she subsequently got raided, I think probably 7 more times looking for him, even though she had told them that he hadn't come home. But that is, I guess, now looking back, the best possible thing to have ever happened to me because that
Oh, so what happened after that?
so this is where I think I probably need to talk about my faith. I always considered myself a Christian growing up, but I had the concept of God, I guess, as some big entity in the sky that I would pray to if I was in trouble. So when I got to jail, I met the most incredible lady who was a prison chaplain at the time. I think that was the point in my life where everything came together. So I started to attend the weekly services that they held in jail. And there was an incredible organization by the name of Prison Fellowship that would come and teach us about the Bible. So my concept of God became an understanding of the Christian faith. And I guess with that, one would think that I would be absolutely horrified in a maximum security prison, but I actually felt carried the whole time. So I began reading the Bible. I began praying every day. And I started to realize that I was at that point where there was no way to go but up. So it was basically ground zero for me. I treated jail like a very strict rehab for me.
Oh,
So
really? I
and that was the best possible outcome. So, the correctional center that I was in was actually a newly renovated one. There was ducted air conditioning in the rooms. The rooms were carpeted, individual showers, and it was just what one would akin to, I guess, a rehab environment. And so that was my journey in jail. And I went from there for my last 3 months into Diwinia, which is another very large jail. However, the whole entire time I just went from, strength to strength to strength, did a lot of courses. And I was at the point where, yeah, my faith was probably what got me through. And just the story one would think would sort of be like I'd get out of jail and then everything would be completely fine.
And
I
how long did you do in jail?
I did 10 months. So I did 10 months. And what had happened in that point in time, although I pled guilty to all the charges, the ballistics reports came back and his fingerprints were actually found on all of the firearms, not mine. So they downgraded the charges and also, so whilst I pled guilty, I was able to plead guilty to, possession instead of the big charges they were trying to hit me with. And so I that was pretty much a bit of a miracle work. So I did 10 months jail and I came out with 24 months parole.
Okay.
Unfortunately, probably 2 weeks out of coming out of jail, and whilst I was the individual that when I would never, ever, ever touch drugs again, I succumbed to loneliness. So that is the point where I think that, I'm very, very passionate about post-release support now. I relapsed, and it was probably 8 months into that relapse that I had my light bulb moment. So with that relapse, I never stopped praying. I never stopped reading the Bible. And I was at the point where I was starting to sort of have like a couple of close run ins with the law. And it was Mother's Day 2010 when I went, you know what? No more. I'm not putting my son through anymore. I'm not going to risk getting back in jail again. This is just not worth it. Like, I'm just not doing this to myself anymore. And I got down on my knees in the shower and I cried out to the Lord, and I went to sleep and I woke up and I never touched drugs again. So it is a miracle story. And I'm not saying that, like, I mean, for me, that I look back and that is actually a miracle. I don't know many people that can go, because I was back intravenously using again, not the same amount of quantities as before, but still, an addiction's an addiction. But literally, so that was 5 years and 3 months ago that I've been clean now.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank
That's
you. And in that time,
Yep.
my life has just, I mean, I've got nothing but just relief and gratitude and praise for God and everything else. I managed to do a Bachelor of Theology in the meantime. So I completed my Bachelor of Theology in this last 5 years. I have been able to give back and work in prison chaplaincy, doing an internship for prison fellowship at one stage. And I now have the biggest blessing of a full-time job. Best of all, my son has been back living with me now for about 3.5 years.
Oh, well,
So, yeah, life is finally back on track. And I am so, so grateful for this second chance at living again.
yeah. And how old's your son now?
He is 20, so he's about to turn 21, and he has probably been made to grow up way too fast. But, we have a very good relationship, and he's studying to be a paramedic. And my biggest prayer for him is that he has a real compassion, I think, for drug addiction. Come the day may be that he may turn up at someone's house that's overdosed, and my prayer for him is that he will carry a special anointing, that he will be able to, reach out to people that are just about to maybe lose their life from a foolish act, and maybe give them a second chance at recovery as well. So,
Oh, love that. That makes me emotional when
oh, Carrie.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Jack, what today also
Yep.
so what else other than your faith,
Yes.
your self-care strategies?
Okay, my self-care strategies are, I bring it all back in. So it's a very busy world out there. It's very chaotic. For me, it's all bring it back to basics. So I personally will spend a lot of time in the Lord. I will pray. I will read the Bible. I will just have my focus. And it doesn't need to be that for everyone else. I mean, depending on, but I think there always needs to be a belief or a faith in something, even if that is yourself. So for me, it's spending time with my pets. It's spending time just relaxing, because I find myself pouring out into every single direction that it is so important to bring it back in. Something as simple as a bath or a walk or just spending time, having a coffee. I'm not much of a nightclubber nowadays, I've got to say. I've become old and wise, but just very simple basics. And I think it's so important in life just to take time sometimes to do absolutely nothing.
That's such great advice. And in the 12-step rooms, they say all the time, don't get over hungry, overtired,
Yep.
over thirsty, or
Yep.
over angry.
Yes, that is so true.
Great strategies there that you talked about. Jack, before we finish, what is your message for the world?
Oh, goodness. Okay. My message to the world is that a recovered life is so worth living. It really is. At one point in my life, I just could not see a way out. I really couldn't. I thought this was it. This was going to be my existence. And so if I could feel that way and come to where I am now, anyone can. You really can. So you just got to keep on going on, because at one stage, things will fall back together. My biggest message, I think, is that kindness is the key to life.
Yeah.
Kindness is something that can move mountains. So, kindness and empathy. And I think it's so, so important to treat everyone, no matter where they are at in life, with that. Because, that is basically, for me, the message that everybody it's a free thing. And if everyone can be kind to one another, then for me, it's the premise which I like to live my life, and the fuel whereby, we can then go in and pull others back out of that fire that we've just come through. So
Thank you. Well, you're such a beautiful human. It's a while now, and you really are a living, breathing story of hope, Jack. So thank you so much.
yeah, you're so welcome.
Thank you for listening to Stories of Hope with Kerry Atherton. If this conversation helped you, please consider sharing the podcast with a friend or leaving a rating and review on your podcast player. If you'd like to find out more about Kerry Atherton, head to storiesofhope.com.au, where you can purchase her books or find her next event. Check the show notes for links and information about our guest in this episode, and remember, you don't have to walk your path alone.